Reading from the book of Romans, chapter 12, verse 10. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves.
Do you have a smartphone? Would you like to follow today's message? Get the YouVersion Bible app. Search for a live event, enter your zip code. You can follow the notes, read deeper into the text, and watch all the video. If you would like to watch the message again or share the message with someone else, go to Crossroads website, click follow us on YouTube. There you can watch today's message or any of our previous videos. Remember, at Crossroads Church, we have an app for that.
Cause we all make mistakes sometimes, and we've all stepped across that line, but nothing sweeter than the day we find forgiveness, and we all stumble and we fall, bridges burn in the heat of it all, but nothing sweeter than the day we call out for forgiveness.
Well, good morning, Crossroads. God is good, and all the time. All right, well, if we haven't met yet, or if you're new here to Crossroads, you might be wondering why I'm up here so much. My name is Caitlyn Stenerson, and I'm the youth director here. And it's an honor to be with you this morning as we continue our series, Better. And as we continue to talk about what it could look like for us to make better choices in our relationship with each other. Well, if you were here for the first week, you may remember these two signs. We talked about the gap between behaviors and expectations, and how sometimes we go into relationships and we assume the worst about people. We assume that they're going to do things that are going to hurt us. We assume that they're going to make us mad somehow. We assume the worst. When really, what we should be doing is believe the best. We should believe that other people are there for us, that they love us and care about us. And so in the first week, we talked about that gap between expectations and behaviors. And in the second week, we were introduced to these two characters, Mr. and Mrs. Mugg. How many of you guys remember Mr. and Mrs. Mugg? They're such a lovely couple, aren't they? So Mr. and Mrs. Mugg, we talked about fighting and how sometimes we just bump up against each other and this stuff spills out. And we're wondering where that came from. And we talked about how every time that we have disagreements, we can choose to fight better. We can choose to fight for what matters. And last week, Pastor Paul and Pastor Deb brought up their love banks. And you may remember they talked about adding into our love banks and adding into each other's love banks and really pouring in and making long-term investments that are going to pay off. We talked about the importance of not letting you become the enemy of us. And we talked about how we can be better together. And this week, we're talking about better romance. So now I'm used to youth group getting a little squirrely when the topic of romance and relationships come up, and you might be getting a little squirrely yourself because romance isn't normally a Sunday morning topic, is it? And so today we're talking about romance, and we're talking about how sometimes it can get just a little bit sticky, and so we're prepared for that. But before we start, let's check in with our couple at Better Labs and see how their first date is going.
Welcome back to the Research Labs of Better. Let's join Martin and Julie again on their first date.
He actually thinks I'm going to give him the tip.
Didn't he just say he's trying to put his kids through college?
Yeah, what a sucker.
It's like watching a train wreck, but let's see what it looks like with Better.
No, keep the change.
Aw, that's so sweet. You're helping him put his kids through college.
I'm a sucker for those stories.
When life hands you choices, choose Better.
Now, I don't know about you, but I love watching this couple's first date. And one thing that I really noticed in this episode of their first date was that look she gave him at the end, right? That like, oh my gosh, you're so generous, I'm so in love with you, look. And maybe you recognize that look, and maybe you recognize that as that first starting to fall in love, really head over heels for each other look. So do you remember that? Do you remember the first time that you looked at somebody and just thought, man, they're perfect? Maybe it was the way he held the door for you on your first date. Maybe it was when he opened the car door for you to get in when you went for a long drive. Maybe it was how nervous she was before she met your parents. Each of us remember these little moments when we first fell in love. And sometimes we like to call that the honeymoon phase. Now, they say that this honeymoon phase says where it says, you're the best person on the planet. You're absolutely perfect. I can't imagine life without you. I can't go one day without thinking about you. They say that honeymoon phase actually only lasts an average of 2 years, 6 months, and 25 days. 2 years, 6 months, and 25 days. Now, some of you may be laughing because you may be like, that long, huh? That's a long, I don't remember it being that long. So what do we do when that honeymoon phase ends, right? What do we do when those really weird quirks that you once loved actually are turning into these little annoyances? What do you do when you don't get butterflies anymore when they walk in the door? What do you do when that honeymoon phase ends? In other words, how do we get from here to there? Romance or intimacy, it requires some intentionality. If you're following along with us in the notes today, that's the cross point for today. So read it with me. Greater intimacy, or intentionality builds intimacy and deep bonds. Intentionality builds intimacy and deep bonds. Romance fades over time. And now the fade isn't intentional, right? Nobody goes into a relationship and they're like, I'm gonna give it 2 months, or 2 years, 6 months, and 25 days before I let this thing fade out a little bit, right? Nobody goes into a friendship and goes, we're gonna hang out all the time for the first 2 months, and then I'm kind of only gonna call every once in a while, and we'll get together like once every 6 months for coffee, and it'll be like an hour because I'll cut it short, right? Nobody goes into a relationship intending for it to fade. But if we're not intentional about our relationships, that's exactly what happens. Maybe that's what happens to our good friends, Mr. and Mrs. Mugg. So Mr. and Mrs. Mugg, they were high school sweethearts. They were actually in algebra class. And then Miss Tumbler looked at Mr. Mugg and she was like, oh, he's so cute. I want to go on a date with him. And so they go on a date and she's head over heels. And she's telling her friend, she's texting her mom mid-date, like, oh yeah, just met my future husband, right? And he's like, pulled in the door for her. He picks up the tab. He makes sure that she sees that he gave a 20% tip, not just 15%, gave her a 20% tip. And they're both like head over heels. And they have these butterflies for each other. And then they get married, and that honeymoon phase, it lasts a little bit longer. But one morning they wake up and they're just bumping up against each other. And it's like everything he does is just annoying. Everything he does. And she's wondering, why did I even marry him? And he's wondering, where'd this stuff come from? This isn't the person I married, right? And it just feels like a mess. You see, an intimate relationship, that's one that sticks together. It's like taking a jar of honey and pouring it all over the stuff in there. That intimacy, when you create that level of intimacy, things are more likely to stick together. And so when you encounter those bumps, when you encounter the things that are going to make this inside stuff spill out, that's going to make the mess, that intimacy helps bind it together to help it last longer, for less stuff to spill out. So our key text this week comes from Paul's letter to the Romans, Romans 12. And this verse helps us to understand how we can choose to create better romance. At the beginning of the passage, Paul says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. You see, if we want to have better intimacy with each other, we have to start by understanding God's grace. Because understanding God's grace for us and our relationship with God, that's going to become a model for our love for one another, for our intimacy and our romance for one another. And the more that we grasp and understand this, the more that intimacy and romance deepens with God. And so the more that intimacy and romance can deepen with the people around us. Because greater intimacy with God, that builds greater intimacy with each other. Greater intimacy with God, that's going to build that greater intimacy. Our relationship with God, that's a grounding force for us. Once we grasp the amount of love and acceptance and grace that God has for us, that's a grounding force. And so when we run into those things that are going to bump up against and shake our sense of acceptance, that's going to shake our acceptance of love, that's going to shake our sense of grace in our lives, having that grounding force of God's love and grace and acceptance for us, that's going to stop less stuff from spilling out. That's like some holy honey on the beads, right? And it's going to keep us in check when we come across those things that are going to shake it. Now, intimacy with God, it also becomes the example of love in our relationships. And so understanding God's no matter what, I'm still going to love you amount of love and grace, that deep and abiding love and grace, that's the pattern for love in our relationships. That no matter what, I'm still in this for you. No matter what you do, I'm still going to protect you. No matter what you do, I'm still going to love you. No matter what you do, I'm still going to look at you like you're the only person on earth. Together as a couple or as friends or as people that are just in a relationship with each other, we can invite that same amount of grace and love and acceptance to be a part of our relationships. One of my favorite verses to share with my friends when they ask for wedding advice is Ecclesiastes 4:9-12. And recently, one of my friends got married, and she asked if I could choose out a few verses, and this was the top one. I was like, you have to do this first. And the verse ends with this. It says, though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves, and a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. So mutually loving God and being in that intimate and vulnerable relationship with God, that allows us to go deeper with each other. Because once we're grounded and we know who we are, we can be more vulnerable with each other. Once we know that no matter what, that sense of grace and love and acceptance, that's not going to shake, that's not going to change, that intimacy is easier because we have that honey on our beads. We know that we're bound to something. We know that no matter what happens, it's all going to be okay. Now, intimacy isn't only what you're probably thinking of right now. And in fact, there are actually 12 different types of intimacy. 12 different types of intimacy. I'm sure there's a few more that are probably yet to be discovered. So of course there's sexual intimacy, which is the physical component of intimacy. But there's also emotional intimacy, which is where you just kind of feel like you and your partner, you get each other. You're on the same wavelength, you're feeling the same things, you feel like you understand their emotions and that they understand yours. You can sense when they're mad. When they walk in the door after a tough day, you know that something happened at work before they even say that something happened at work. Or when they're really excited about something, you can tell that they're really excited about it with them even having to tell you that they're really excited about it. That's emotional intimacy. There's also intellectual intimacy, which is where you're interested in some of the same subjects and you're interested in what your spouse or your significant other or your friends are learning. You want to know more about what they're doing. You want your kids to say what they learned in school. You're building that intellectual intimacy. You're learning from each other, and you're learning with each other. There's also aesthetic intimacy. So if any of you have ever watched a sunset with a significant other or maybe gone to the Grand Canyon on a family trip, you know which type of intimacy I'm talking about. That's that intimacy where you feel bound together because you're looking at beauty together. You're appreciating and admiring beauty. There's also creative intimacy. You just like doing stuff together. It could be repainting the kitchen and you would be so excited because you're being creative together. You're experiencing creative intimacy. There's recreational intimacy, which is where when you take the dog for a walk with your significant other, or maybe you go for a run with your friends, or you're at the beach with some friends, and you're experiencing this level of, we're in this together. You're enjoying each other. You don't even have to talk, and you feel intimate with each other. There's also work intimacy, which is where maybe you're redoing the deck, maybe you're washing the car, maybe you're helping pick out school supplies for your kids. You're working on a mutual project. This can happen with coworkers too. You have a shared task list, and so you're experiencing this level of work intimacy. There's also crisis intimacy, and that's when the bad times come and you're experiencing tough stuff and you're growing closer together as a couple. That's because you're experiencing crisis intimacy. You're coping with problems together. You're trying to figure out how to make this work together. And then there's conflict intimacy, which is where you're actually growing closer together the more that you're trying to figure out your disagreements. And so the more that you're trying to work out, well, you believe this and I believe that, sometimes we see that as I'm growing apart from them. You're actually growing together the more you try to work those out. That's conflict intimacy. And then there's commitment intimacy, which is where you're working on your marriage together. You're working with your kids together. We're committed to our family. We're committed to our marriage. We're committed to this project. We're committed to our finances. You have this commitment level, and so you're intimate with each other because you're both working towards the same goal. And if you're here today at Crossroads with your spouse or your significant other or your children or your friends, you're actually experiencing right now spiritual intimacy. And spiritual intimacy is a shared religious experience. You feel connected to people because you're in here worshiping together. You feel connected to people because you're in here learning together. Finally, there's communication intimacy, and that's the 12th type of intimacy. That feels like you're mutually understood. You feel like when you say something, your spouse just really gets you. You feel like when you explain it, that they understand. You feel like when your kids tell you something, they feel appreciated. And that's all that is just appreciating each other's ideas, affirming one another, talking through the different things. And these levels of intimacy, they're not experienced one at a time. And in fact, you could be at this moment experiencing a few different levels of intimacy. Maybe you're in here and you're experiencing spiritual intimacy because you're in here with your family. And then you're going to go home and you're going to do your fall chores together and experience work intimacy. And then you're going to go spend some family time at the park. And that's intimacy too. And so you could experience multiple different types of intimacy at one time. You can experience multiple types in a day. You can even experience multiple types in a different season. You can also experience them one at a time. So maybe you're in a season of your life and it's just really busy, and right now, all you have is just that commitment intimacy or that work intimacy. But you're going to experience different types of intimacy throughout your life with people. You see, better romance and intimacy actually binds us together. The deeper intimacy that we experience in any of these forms, the more that honey is going to hold us together. So Song of Songs is one of my absolute favorite books. And I love the relationship that's portrayed throughout the book. And it tells us in that book that love's as strong as death, that it's unyielding as the grave, that it's a blazing fire, it's a mighty flame, and water can't extinguish it. That's some love. How many of us would like a love like that? Like, it's so strong that absolutely nothing can change it. Nothing can change it. So Song of Songs is about a deeply intimate couple. And it's pretty clear from the start that they're bound together extremely tightly. And that's what we crave, right? We want like this love that makes us feel secure. We want this love that makes us feel safe. We want this love where we know that no matter what, that person's still going to be in this with me. No matter what, that person's still going to be on my side. Better romance also has the right motivation. So if you still have your finger in Romans 12, I want you to flip back there for me. Here, the Apostle Paul is talking about the relationships that we have with one another. And this isn't an explicit relationship, dating, and marriage passage. And so if you're in here today and you're single, I want you to know that everything that we're talking about today still applies to you. Everything in this whole series still applies to you because you're still in relationship with other people. You still have friends and coworkers and family members that you're in relationship with. And so everything that we're talking about still applies. So Paul reminds us in Romans 12 that we're better together. He says, for just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not have all the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance to your faith. If it's serving, then serve. If it's teaching, then teach. If it's to encourage, then give encouragement. If it's giving, then give generously. If it's to lead, do it diligently. If it's to show mercy, do it cheerfully. So Paul is reminding us here that we each have a different service that we can give to one another, that we each need each other in this, that we're one body made up of many parts, that not everyone's going to have the same gifting, but he also reminds us of the motivations that we need to have here, doesn't he? And he talks about that when you serve, do it cheerfully. When you're doing your work, do it well. So in here, he's saying that love for us, it isn't some sort of what can you do for me in return. If you're a Christian, love shouldn't be what can you do for me in return. If I scratch your back, can you scratch mine? Not something like that. This love that he's talking about, this is about building up one another. It's about encouraging one another. It's about putting the other person first, no matter what. And so the motivation that we should have behind our love is always to build up other people and to serve other people, no matter what's going on. This sounds a little bit different than how the world sometimes thinks of service and relationships, isn't it? You see, better romance, it's not selfish. It doesn't think that it's better than the other person for what they can do and the other person can't do. It's intentional and it's sincere in its actions. And so deep love requires intentionality. Like we talked about earlier, nobody goes into a relationship and says in 2 years, 6 months, and 25 days, we're gonna drift apart. I mean, imagine how weird that would be if on your first date, your significant other looked at you and was like, this is gonna be really great for 2 years, 6 months, and 25 days, and then after that, you're kinda gonna question why you fell in love with me. You would never go on another date with that person, right? So nobody goes into it intending to do that. Everybody goes into the relationship like that old couple, we're gonna be together for 80 years. We're gonna be together for 80 years. We're still gonna be more in love on our last day than we were on our first. Everybody goes into it with that intentionality. And so what happens when that drifts? What happens? How does that happen? Well, deep love means that we make a daily choice to choose better. We make a daily choice to choose better. Romans 12 tells us that we should bless those who persecute us. It says in here, be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless them and don't curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. These things, those create intentionality. If you're gonna bless those who persecute you, if you're gonna continue to pray for those who hurt you, if you're gonna stick in it in the long haul no matter what happens, you have to be intentional about it. And so how do we do that? How can we walk out the door today and be more intentional about our relationships? I think there's 4 really good places for us to start. The first one is to create time for one another. We live in a world where it's extremely easy for us to just let our relationships slide. We live in a world where it's extremely easy to get home after a long day of work and not really want to spend any time with our spouse or our kids. We live in a world where it's really easy to just let our friendship slide and figure we can pick it up in 6 months. So make time for one another. And maybe it's 30 minutes before you go to bed. Maybe it's 15 minutes if you're really pressed for time, or 5 minutes before you go to bed. And maybe it's calling up your friends once a week just to see how they're doing. Maybe it's planning to get together with your friends at least once a month and grab a cup of coffee. It doesn't have to be a big amount of time, but just craving out and carving out this intentional amount of time that you can spend together, just checking in. The next thing that we can do is we can communicate frequently, honestly, and clearly. Frequently, honestly, and clearly. We can be honest about what we're experiencing. We can be honest about what we're feeling about our relationships and talk about it often. Don't let problems bubble up until they're ready to explode, but just address things and be honest about it. And do it clearly. Clearly outline how you feel. We live in a world where people are like, how are you? And you're like, I'm fine. No one's ever just fine. No one's ever just fine. But we're always like, I'm fine, I'm good. Just be honest. Just say clearly what's going on. Just invite people to be in a conversation with you. The next thing that we can do daily is touch and embrace often. For some people, if any of you have taken the love languages inventory, this might be your number 1 love language. You might be a physical touch person. You probably know you're a physical touch person because you're like the huggy one out of your friend group. You're the one that's always giving the hugs and the fist bumps and patting people on the shoulder, and you know you're a physical touch person. You crave that physical touch, and that's how you experience intimacy with other people. And so giving that physical touch is a great way to develop intimacy. That tells people, I care about you. I'm here for you. That physical touch creates these bonds between us that says, you can trust me. You can trust in me. I love you. I'm in this for you. And one of the last things that we can do as a starting point is to be generous with praise. It's really easy to be a cynic. It's really easy to see what's going wrong. It's really easy to continue to think that the other person doesn't have your best interest at heart after something happens. It's really easy to be a cynic. And so being generous with praise, being overly generous with praise, nobody's ever going to get mad at you for complimenting them too much. So telling people, hey, you did a great job today. Telling your spouse, I really appreciate when you helped out with the kids today. Telling your significant other, I really like the color that you painted the wall. That was a great choice. Being sure to lavish praise on each other. Telling your coworkers, that project that you worked on turned out amazing. You did so good. Just making sure that we're creating these intimate spaces to be able to compliment each other and to be able to tell people how much we care and appreciate about them. That's a great way to create intimacy. These choices, they aren't always easy, are they? And so you may be looking at me up here and you may be like, Caitlyn, I don't see a ring. You don't know what my marriage is like. You don't know what my family's like. You don't know how difficult my coworkers make it. You don't know what my friends have done to me. You don't know what my spouse said to me. You don't know what my kids have done. This choice is not easy for me. You may be feeling like no matter how hard you try in your relationship, there's no response. You may be feeling like you would rather give up today. You may actually be thinking that you'd rather go home today and pack your bags. You might feel like ending that friendship. You might feel like telling that family member that you can't deal with it anymore. And maybe, just maybe, the problem that you're facing, maybe it's not necessarily him or her. Maybe it's not them. Maybe it has to do with the lens that you're viewing them in. You see, better relationships, better intimacy, and eventually better romance, it's best discovered by looking through the right lens. So some people approach their relationship with this lens. What do you see when you look in this lens? Yourself. You see yourself. And so some people approach their relationships like this, and they look in here and they say, well, this doesn't serve me anymore. And they see it as a me relationship. And if it doesn't help them anymore, if it doesn't serve them anymore, if it hurts them more than it helps them anymore, they see it through the me relationship and they're like, well, I don't want to try anymore. It doesn't benefit me anymore. I don't want to try anymore. And that's the wrong place to start intimacy with yourself. Because if you're trying to develop an intimate relationship with another person, you can't look at it through the lens of yourself. You can't develop a relationship that way. And some people, they look at their relationship through this lens. Some people, they're looking at their relationship through maybe rose-colored glasses. And maybe everything that happens, they're like, well, it's okay. You might have friends like this, they're a little bit of a martyr about it. Bad things happen, and they're like, but it's okay. Don't worry about it. I don't want to step on toes. I don't want to be honest about what I'm feeling. It's okay. They're looking at it through this lens. More often than not, it's the other way around. They're looking at it through the lens of everything that this person does, they're doing to hurt me. Everything that they do is to hurt me. And if they're doing something nice, it's just because they want something. And they're looking at it through this cynical lens. And you can't see people clearly through this lens. You can't. You can see a distortion of what's going on, but you can't see people clearly through this lens. So this is a terrible place to build intimacy. And the next lens that a lot of people will look at their relationships through is this one. And you might be looking at this one, and you might think, well, that's not too bad. Stained glass. It's pretty. It's nice. Let's call this one the pious lens. This lens says, if you would have just listened to me, we wouldn't be fill in the blanks. If you would just listen to me about the finances, we wouldn't be dealing with the finances we're dealing right now. If you would have just listened to me about that job choice 10 years ago, you wouldn't be unhappy right now. If you would have just listened to me, if you would have just done what I did, if you would just be a little more like me, we wouldn't be dealing with any of this right now. This is the pious lens that says, I know what's right, you know what's wrong, and you're not doing what I said you're doing. You can't build an intimate relationship when you're looking through that lens. The only way that you can build an intimate relationship is to look through this lens. This lens is the only one that's going to allow you to see what's really there. This lens is called the lens of grace. And when we look through this lens, we can see clearly what's going on. We see the other person for who they are. We see the relationship for what it is. We see what's actually going on between us and our spouse. We see what's going on between us and our kids, us and our friends, us and our coworkers. We see everything that's going on through this lens, but we're looking at it through the lens of grace. We're looking at it through the eyes of God. And we're seeing the strengths and the relationships of the weakness, but we're saying, I'm still going to love you anyways. I get that we're having this problem. I can see that we're having this problem, but I'm going to give you grace on this one. We're going to work through this. I still love you. I'm still going to hang on to you. No matter what, you're looking through that lens of grace. This is the no matter what love. This is the love that builds deep and abiding intimacy. The lens of grace. This is the lens that helps us to build each other up. This is the lens that helps us to pour some honey on so that when times get tough, we're not spilling out so much junk. This is the lens that builds intimacy. Let's pray as I invite the worship team back up. Lord God, you are a God that craves relationship with us. You're a God that has moved the seas to make a relationship with us. You're the God that has risked everything to be in relationship with us. Lord God, you've set the example of what it looks like for us to love you and love other people. You set the example of what it looks like to show grace to each other, to show grace when we don't deserve it. Lord God, I just pray today that you would help us to look through that lens of grace at the people around us, to look through the lens of grace at our spouse and our kids and our siblings and our parents, to look through the lens of grace at our friends and our coworkers. Lord God, help us to see clearly what's happening and still be able to love one another. And help us to be able to develop strategies that are going to bring deeper intimacy in those relationships. Guide us in our daily actions, that we can show more love to one another. And as we worship today, may it just be a small reflection of the praise that we lavish on you and the love that you lavish on us. In your name we pray, amen.